Hello, Father Slater. Thank you for joining the Spiritual Context podcast.
Okay.
And today we are at the Abbey of Genesee in Pifford, upstate New York. And the first question I have for you is, what is a monk?
Well, that's a big question in a way. The word monk in English probably comes from monos, one. So a monk is somebody who is one, single-hearted in their focus, and they also are one in the sense that they live alone. They're not married, typically celibate. And there's also, interestingly, another possible derivation from the word from menios in Greek, meaning to remain or to dwell. So the monk could be thought of as one who dwells, one who abides, one who remains, and one who is alone. And the basic idea of the monk is somebody who is a renunciant and perhaps a contemplative who steps apart from the ordinary affairs of life to focus single-mindedly on seeking the transcendent.
And how did you come to become a monk?
Sheer desperation would be the most honest answer, which is not only my answer, that's a common answer in the tradition. But I think, I had the image of the monk first on my radar when I was maybe 16, and something about just the figure of the monk, of somebody who is so single-mindedly devoted to one thing, the simplicity and the radicality of what the monk represented spoke to me, attracted me. And then, I sort of gravitated in the direction of the monastery in my early 20s. In my late teens, mid to late teens, I went on a retreat at a Jesuit retreat house. And it was my first experience of being in silence with a group of men out in the country with a regular schedule, good spiritual conferences, talks given by the Jesuits. And that kind of awakened the appetite. I mean, part of me was kind of wondering, what would it be like to do this for a living or all the time, something about that experience of leisure and spaciousness during the retreat was very helpful to me and healing. And then when I first began to visit monasteries, I fell in love again with that spaciousness and leisure and the whole sort of context in which the liturgy was practiced and so on.
Had you not become a monk, what do you think your life would have looked like? What were the other options at that time?
Well, I probably would have stayed in academia and probably be teaching English literature would be my guess, or philosophy, or some
Right.
combination.
You dropped out of school.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, I finished my degree early and entered the Catholic Church with a view to becoming a monk. And you've got to be Catholic for a couple of years before you enter a monastery. So I worked and paid off my student loans and then entered the monastery.
And clearly it is even though it happens gradually in stages, it is a lifelong commitment to, and in the case of the Cistercian order, it is a lifelong commitment to a place, to a community, and a way of life, a schedule, a rule. How does one know? So I'm asking in your case, but also more generally, how does one know what one's vocation is, what one's path is? How does one discern that?
Yeah, on one of those Jesuit retreats when I was 17 years old, I remember something somebody said during one of those talks actually stuck with me in this connection. And he said that you have found your vocation when you found the way of life in which it's easiest for you to love. And I was very struck by that. I think it's like finding the right distance as a runner. Am I a marathoner? Am I a sprinter? Am I somewhere in between? What's the distance, the practice in which I can give myself 110% without counting the cost, because I'm just flourishing. I'm in love. I'm completely firing on all cylinders, And for me, the monastic life had the kind of context and supports and challenges that I needed to grow and to flourish.
So when you say easiest for you to love, you're not saying it's without difficulties, of course, but you have the required energy to wholeheartedly face your difficulties, where you find that within yourself.
Right, because you're so attracted and drawn. It's like when Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, a job which he didn't want originally, but he was persuaded by the Pope to take up this project. And once he got into it, he was obsessed like a madman, and he would barely sleep and hardly ate anything and just want to climb up that scaffold and keep painting the ceiling because he had a vision and he was so engaged creatively. He just wanted to see this thing to completion. He was bearing fruit so abundantly that he had to get it done. And so he, if he had just been trying to eat less or sleep less as an end in itself, he wouldn't have got anywhere. But, he was, and monastic life is like that. It's not asceticism as an end in itself. You're not just training and fasting and doing vigils as an end in itself. It's a means to an end, which is to seek union with God and correspondingly to be able to give oneself, to live and to love 100%.
Mm-hmm. And in the same regard, you've also said God plants desires in our heart as a way of guiding us, or to the degree that he will fulfill them. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's something Saint Therese of Lisieux actually said, that, God puts a desire, a spiritual desire in our heart in the measure in which he plans to fulfill it. So those seeds of desire are something that we need to attend to very carefully. Sometimes desire is suspect, or we think of it as selfish, but there is such a thing as right desire, and it is a guide for us.
So how can we discern between a true deep longing or desire and something that is a mere impulse or temptation or an illusion?
Yeah, that's a good question. One is its persistence, that it abides, and another would be its depth, that is coming from somewhere deep down. And then whether there's something compulsive about it and obsessive, or rather it brings a sense of peace and a sense of rightness. Those would be a few guideposts.
Let me ask the same question in a little bit of a different way, because desires can also be renounced, can be let go. You can let go of a desire. How does one discern when to persist, when to let go? And I can put it in a more concrete situation. Let's say a writer wants to publish a book and they've been querying for agents with agents, and they've queried 80, 90, 95, 99 agents and haven't heard back from any one of them. So they might say, maybe this is not my path, and then drop it. Or they might think that, oh, maybe the lesson here is perseverance and persistence, and I should do that. How does one discern?
Yeah, there's a saying of Simone Weil that one ought to only do those good things which we cannot not do. And I like this saying, and I think it's very clarifying. She also says that as we go along and our spiritual life deepens, there are more and more things that we cannot not do. So I think it's along those lines. If we really believe in, whether it's a book project or something along those lines, that this is meant to be shared, then we stick with it and hope that something opens up. I mean, there's all kinds of stories about great writers that, masterpieces that were sent around to dozens of different publishers before they found a home, and we're glad that those writers persisted. So, yeah.
So then the crucial factor, I suppose, is whether one cannot not do it. That's the touchstone.
Yeah. And there's also an element of timing. I mean, sometimes we have to let a project go and come back to it, or leave a book to one side and then wait for an opening.
Mm-hmm.
But then also be alert when the opening arises. Like, you keep the door open. You can be just banging your head against the wall, persisting, trying to get something, and it's just not the right time. And sometimes it's best to just set it aside and come back. And that's another element in discerning desire. Do you have the freedom to set it aside and come back? Or are you compulsively forced to, carry on even when it seems best to set something down.
That might be also a clue into whether it's driven by ego
Right,
or one is pulled by something higher,
right.
something greater.
Yeah.
hmm What is a typical day at the monastery like here?
Well, we have the day has a kind of skeleton or schedule based, and so we have 7 periods of prayer over the course of the day. The first beginning at 3:30 in the morning. So we wake up for what we call vigils at 3:30. That lasts about 45 minutes. These are periods of chanting the Psalms and listening to verses of scripture interspersed with times of silence. And vigils goes from about 3:30 to 4:15. Then you have about 2.25 hours for silent prayer, reading the scriptures. You get breakfast in there somewhere, reading, study, mostly prayer during that time. Keeping watch is the idea of vigil. You're getting up at this early morning hour to nourish a spirit of watchfulness and expectancy. Then there is the daily Eucharist and another period of prayer at daybreak. And we go about the day's work begins shortly after that. And the rest of the day is broken up by periods of prayer, liturgical prayer in church, intermingled with work and, different responsibilities one might have around the monastery, and classes for those in formation that are just beginning the monastic life. And you have some free time. Like each day, you probably have roughly about 5 or 6 hours of unscripted time where you can read or exercise or walk in the woods, whatever.
And correct me if my understanding is incorrect. Previously, there was more silence, and now it's more open to maybe talking among one another. Is that correct?
Yeah, before Vatican II, the silence was quite rigid, and they used a kind of primitive sign language, which is still in existence. It's kind of like the Pig Latin of sign language. It's not very, very developed, but it was kept simple on purpose so that you could have only kind of rudimentary exchanges using these basic signs. But some of the brothers became quite adept, and they could say all kinds of funny things, recombining the signs in creative ways. So that was definitely stricter, but it led to problems, and so it was relaxed to some degree after Vatican II. And each community varies in the degree and the way that it observes silence a little bit. It also depends on the makeup of the community. If you have a lot of quiet, introverted people, your observance of silence will probably be better or for worse. But the idea is that basically throughout the day, we really only speak as necessary for work, or if we're having a community meeting or something to make decisions, then of course we speak. And, depending on your work responsibilities, you may need to interact with the public or doctor's offices or contractors or something. So, some people do a fair amount of speaking in the course of the average day, and other people, it's fairly quiet. But the atmosphere in the hallways and the cloister and the church is kept silent. You're trying to cultivate an atmosphere of recollection and peace and quiet.
You've talked about the monastic life as an embrace of limitation, the limitation that the rule and the schedule presents, but paradoxically embracing the limitation as being freeing. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. At the beginning of the rule of Saint Benedict, in the prologue to the text, he talks about how the monastic practice seems very narrow at the outset. But if a person perseveres in faith, that they're able to run on the path of God's commandments. So practice becomes something that one is energized by and able to do with great abandon. As one's heart expands in dilatatio cordis, the dilation of the heart, as you embrace the way of radical limitation, one's heart opens and one is able to embrace the limits of the day with great freedom. And what formerly was constricting is now a guide rail. right? This interesting thing about limits is that from one angle, the limit contains and constricts, but from another, it guides the direction of and channels energy that in itself is wide open.
How, how can someone who's not a monastic, who's not living a monastic life, embrace the same philosophy and say, embrace the limitations presented by their day, by their circumstances, situations, social, economic, political, psychological, biological, and find freedom in that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a distinction between the limitations that we impose on ourselves by our conditioning and our limited frame of reference, the different habits we develop, and the view that we have, the sense of self that we carry. All of that constricts us in ways that may not be so helpful. So there's a distinction there between our self-limitation and the actual contours of everyday life that arise. And the monastic approach is to be freed from attachment to our own way, to what's called in the tradition self-will. We become freed from self-will by learning to accord ourselves with God's will, providence, as it arises in everyday situations and encounters. So the monastic practice of living according to a rule, under an abbot, as part of a tradition, with a schedule and so on, and all of these limitations outside of oneself, learning to live within that framework takes you away from attachment to your own self-will. So it's about cultivating a spirit of obedience or willingness, pliability between the extremes of will-lessness, where you have no backbone and take no initiative, and willfulness, where you're just pushing your own way. Most of us incline to one extreme or the other. We're inclined to either force our own way and dominate situations to make them conform with our own preferences, or to please people and be a kind of pushover that doesn't show any initiative or creativity. And the goal, or a healthy expression of freedom, is willingness, which is a responsiveness to life. So we can take initiative and we can also respond creatively to situations as they arise.
So it's a radical embrace. First, the distinction that you made between self-limiting beliefs, self-limiting habits and propensities, and what arises in daily life, say chronic illness that you've been diagnosed with. And even with that situation, I can have all kinds of beliefs that constricts my creative response to that. So one, there is a letting go of that in order to fully embrace and see the possibility that this event offers.
The possibility for growing closer to God, for growing in freedom, to somehow do something beautiful with my life, even if my possibilities have become radically constricted as by a severe illness.
Mm-hmm. And the Cistercians are a contemplative order, and we'll talk more about what is contemplation and what is the contemplative life in a minute. But you've talked about how it's a paradox of sorts. On the one hand, a monk leaves the world behind, renounces the world, and enters into a semi-solitary life. But on the other hand, you've mentioned how by doing so, a monk becomes one with all of humanity, specifically in the suffering of humanity. How does that work?
It's mysterious, of course, but the idea is that the monk goes apart from all for the sake of all, that the monk withdraws out of solidarity with humanity, especially humanity at its most marginal and in its weakest members. And the monk is becoming an outsider and aligning himself with those who are on the outside and keeping vigil with them and praying with them and for them. And, that can be discussed from different angles, one way is through the metaphor of the body. St. Paul uses the image of the body, that we are one body, the mystical body of Christ, and each of the different parts has its own function. So not every member of the body can be a hand out serving the poor. There has to be an ear, an eye, a brain, etc. And the monk in Thérèse of Lisieux speaks about how the contemplative vocation is to be like the heart in the body that's pumping blood to all the different members. So it's something like that, perhaps, a kind of spiritual support for others. And practice, so there's a mystical level on which one may believe that somehow one is bringing grace and mercy into the world and channeling it to other members of the body, the human family. And there's also a practical expression where you cultivate a certain culture of quiet and worship and so on, and other people come and experience that by staying at your guest house, by taking part in the liturgy, which is open to the public, and by getting a taste of what it might be like to live in that monastic ambiance.
The other day when I was here with students from St. Bernard's, you talked about the image of a wheel. And as we get closer, we are like spokes in the wheel. And as we get closer, we get closer to the center. We also get closer to one another. Is that right?
Yes.
Father Vinny, who passed away recently, he was a Paulist father in Columbus. He used to talk about that a lot. I didn't know where that came from. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's an image from Dorotheus of Gaza in the 5th century, I think, who spoke about this as a way of understanding. I mean, God is the center of the wheel. And so the closer we get to the center, each of us is like a spoke. And the closer each of us gets to the center, the closer we get to one another. The spokes are closer to one another towards the center. And the further away from God we get towards the perimeter of the wheel, the further we get from one another. That's the way the image works. And it occurs in a discourse related to not judging others. So, yes.
So the implication then, if I go within to the depths of my being and heal within myself my own ailments, where I am deviating from God, where I'm turning away from God, heal those parts within myself, have I then contributed to healing the world in some way, even though I may never leave my monastic cell?
Yeah, I think it works that way. It's mysterious, but I've been reading something recently that talks about how trauma is passed from one generation to the next and how we carry trauma from previous generations in our own DNA. And if we're able to sort of interrupt destructive behaviors and defenses and so on, and unlock and heal our own wounds, that not only doesn't pass on the traumas we've inherited to the next generation, but we bring some healing retroactively into our past. So I think there are ways that it definitely, the work we do in our own hearts spills over to others, you know. There's a saying of one of the fathers, that a modern desert father in a way, Seraphim of Sarov, who said that keep your heart at peace and a multitude around you will be saved.
So I asked this question also because there is a insistence in our culture today, in the American culture, even at that university, that it's not enough, for instance, for you to just be the eye. You also have to be the hand. Everyone, wherever they are, whatever they're doing, if you're a physician or if you're a lawyer or if you are a professor, everyone also has to be, say, an activist, because everyone carries that burden and should therefore in that way contribute to the world. But the implication there is that being a physician to the best of one's ability with the purest of one's intent is not enough. Or so I guess the question is it enough?
Yeah, we could be making things worse depending on what our motives are. If we haven't done our own inner work, then we could think that we're saving the world, but we could be just spreading around our own inner turmoil and making things worse than they need to be. So then you go to the other extreme and you say, oh, well, do I have to go to a cave for 20 years? And like, how perfect do I have to be before I can start acting and serving in the world? You know, I mean, it's a kind of a balance, but each person has to come to their own balance and carefully discern the way forward. But I think that probably culturally, our tendency is towards activism, to prematurely engaging in some form of service or engagement before we've done the inner work, and that has consequences. And that, you know, that kind of approach where one does only those good things that one cannot not do, really limiting oneself to those things that really, like a cause or a project that you just can't see a way. You have to do this. This calls to you. You can't not intervene or stand up for this or that cause. Because a lot of the ways that we take action, you know, signing petitions, going to protests, there may be a place for that, but it's somewhat limited and it's kind of anonymous or disconnected from me. So a lot of the major social movements are grounded at a grassroots level by people who were directly affected by this or that issue or injustice. And it was a very particular site that they were, you know, working to heal. And then maybe things grow out from that. But if it doesn't start in the particular, it's not going to be anchored in a way that's really compelling or gets traction, it seems.
Right. It's responding to the needs of the moment and place.
It's very easy to get lost in big storylines and to get trapped and just to feel good about myself because I'm taking part in some cause that I feel good, or a kind of posturing. Yeah.
Now to get to the main topic. What is God?
Love. That's the love expressed as willingness to suffer.
Love expressed as willingness to suffer is God.
Is God in the world, revealed in Jesus Christ. That's the Christian answer, is that God is love, unconditional love beyond anything we can imagine, and that was expressed most profoundly in a unique way in the life of Jesus, ultimately in his willingness to go to the cross and suffer out of love for humanity, to express, to convince humanity of the gratuity of God's love, that it's an unconditional love with no strings attached, that's willing to suffer even this death on the cross. And by such a radical expression of love, hoping to awaken a similarly gratuitous love in other human beings out of gratitude, not, as so often has been expressed, as some kind of quid pro quo. I suffered this much for you. Can't you at least do this? Which is how we often hear Christianity. My son went to the cross, and can't you even fast from chocolate for Lent or something? You know, it's ridiculous. The whole idea is that God expresses this gratuitous love, taking the risk, hoping to awaken a gratuitous response from us, so that our response is like Michelangelo painting that ceiling of the chapel, that we're all in, you know, we're giving ourselves 110% in a radical, generous way without counting the cost, out of gratitude.
Would you share with us your deepest, or one of your deepest experiences of this love, of this God, maybe in your moments of silence or prayer?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to put into words. I think at a certain level, your entire life is the expression of what you're receiving in prayer. So it's hard to isolate any particular experience. I think that, you know, in general, Christian spiritual experience has many different faces, but one aspect would be the experience of compunction, where a person, and certainly I've had this experience myself many times, it's very, you know, central in monastic spirituality, and I think in Christian spirituality more broadly, where a person comes to experience their own mortality or guilt or self-delusion. They see the ways that they've been hurting people that they care about and behaving selfishly, and they're suddenly caught up short and see their own delusion in a clear-minded way and are filled with remorse and bitter remorse sometimes. But in the same moment that they see their weakness, they also see that they're loved unconditionally all the way down with no strings attached. And it's that simultaneous experience in which a person is struck to the heart and sheds tears of remorse, but also gratitude, and experiences a sense of hopefulness and a motivation to make a change in one's life and go forward in a new way. This experience of a kind of deep moral conversion, that is a key experience. And it's often connected to scripture, reading the word of God and being struck and moved at this deep level, kind of illuminated by something in scripture. So that is one characteristic level of experience. And that heals the heart and quiets the heart so that gradually a person starts to gravitate towards stillness and quiet and a kind of inward resting in the presence of God, where there's no longer God's presence and my presence, but simply presence. And one finds their way to a state of deep rest and tranquility that in turn spills over into the rest of one's day and continues to heal one's passion. So one remains active and continues to serve others and do one's work in the world, whatever that might be. But it's anchored in that experience of stillness. It's arising from stillness and going back into stillness. And the activity becomes just one more expression of that tranquility.
What would you say are some things that people believe about love or God that are not true, but people, Christians included, non-Christians too, generally tend to believe?
Hmm. Well, I guess it depends what sort of love one is talking about. You know, ideas that we have about love that are misguided. Well, one, in the Christian tradition, there's been this whole tortuous debate between agape love and eros love. So the idea that agape love characterizes God and it's completely selfless and generous, and only God can really love in that way, and that human beings are trapped in eros love, left to themselves. They can only love in a way that's born of their own neediness and selfishness, right? Well, first, that's a very misguided characterization of eros. There is such a thing as right desire and a healthy eros, and one can even speak of, as the tradition does, of God's eros, and of even of God's eros loving through human eros and elevating and purifying it. So in God, generous, outgoing love and the love of desire, the love born of delight, are actually one. There's no fundamental separation between them. Divine love finds its delight in giving itself away. Generosity is the free and generous and natural overflow of its desire. Its desire is to give itself away. Giving itself away is its delight. And for human beings too, I mean, that's the love that Jesus modeled. And for followers of Jesus, as they grow, as their spiritual life matures, their love has that aspect also more and more, that there's no longer any real division between what I want and what God wants. Now, that's a slippery, you can fool yourself very easily, right? And just say, well, God wants me to be rich and famous or, whatever. But in a real way, as a person does become more aligned with God, then they really find their delight in doing his will. They would rather see God's will done in their life than, seek after some immediate gratification for themselves. Because they know that God's will and their own deepest heart's desire are fundamentally one.
If I understand you correctly, there are a few things in what you're saying. One, in that the love of God does not require nor does to love mean that we deny ourselves of our own God-given desires, let's say. And in that, eventually our will and God's will becomes one. And I think that brings us back to what you had said earlier. God puts the desire in our heart to the measure that he will fulfill them. And the second thing that you're saying, it seems to me, is also that, and this is something that is evident here in seeing you, but also I watched a few videos of the other monks here. They seem genuinely happy. One of the monks, he was talking about just how happy he is, how happy his life is. And it seems that to love God is, yes, there is a willing embrace of suffering, but in order to transcend that suffering, it's not about guilt, sin, repentance in the sense of beating oneself down. But as you said, when we become aware of our own shortcoming, it happens with the awareness of the mercy and love of God.
Yeah, I mean, love in a world of suffering, when I say that love is expressed as willingness to suffer, that means it's willing to suffer with and for other people who are suffering. You know, that's just the shape. The willingness to suffer is just the shape that love takes in a broken world, it seems to me.
What is God's will? What does it mean to follow God's will?
Yeah, that's a good question, because historically, the tradition often seems to picture God as some angry potentate throwing lightning bolts. And, you know, he's imagined on the image of a monarch who's imposing his will autocratically from the heavens. And that's a very limited and unfortunate way of understanding. It's modeled clearly on the human ego. So I think instead of understanding the will of God as on this kind of autocratic model of God as the monarch hurling thunderbolts, it's possible to think of God's will as something like the Tao, as a way, and as a way that is yielding and free and open, unhurried, not imposing itself, but having a kind of inevitability as well, the way of things. Rather than thinking of the will of God, what if we thought of the way of God, and that way was something like the way as the Tao is described? You know, I find that the most compelling way to imagine it.
Right, and that recontextualizes the whole matter. And I ask the question also because I've seen, including in myself in the past, but in many people who are spiritually, religiously inclined, a paralysis of decision making because they're stuck thinking, well, does God want me to do this or not? What is God's will for me? And it can become a matter of not being able to take decisions, make decisions at all, take actions at all. There's a professor of Chinese philosophy, Roger Ames. He translates the way as way making. And I think that encapsulates what you had said before, that the truest, deepest longing in your own heart is the will of God for you to move forward in that direction. Would that be a correct characterization?
Yeah, so instead of the autonomous ego making decisions according to its own ideas and storylines, it's more a matter of coming to be in tune with one's own heart and the deepest longings of one's own heart and the deepest meaning of one's own life and relationships. And then from a place of really being in tune with what's happening and emerging in my life, in my heart, deciding, making decisions that what is life calling me to in this moment.
What is God's judgment?
It's the non-judgment of the cross. It's Jesus revealing himself as unconditional mercy on the cross and saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so that judgment, which is the non-judgment of love, at the same time exposes and reveals human hearts. It exposes and reveals all of our darkness in the face of that unconditional expression of love. So there's a verse in Luke that talks about Jesus on the cross as a sign of contradiction, and how that sign of contradiction is such that many hearts will be revealed. The thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. So in a mysterious way, the crucified brings to light all of human darkness and is the way to heal it also. It exposes our violence against others, the victims that we create, and it also exposes our own self-hatred and the ways that we destroy and thwart and suppress what's best in ourselves as well.
So it is the light of truth, because it brings to light what is hidden, what needs to be brought to light. But you're also saying that truth, I guess this is what in Buddhism they talk about, wisdom and compassion. And I've always thought the Christian version is love and truth. You're saying truth is love. It is brought to light to be healed, not to be punished.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Yeah.
There's another question about the same topic, but I want to run something by you, and you tell me if I have understood this correctly. I came to Christianity later in life when I came to the United States from Nepal, and I was already familiar with some Hindu teachings, Buddhist teachings, and then I am looking into Christianity. And Christ on the cross, in a way it made sense to me, in a way it didn't, until one time I was doing a week-long retreat with Father Vinny, who's a Paulist. It was a centering prayer week-long retreat where we would do Mass every day and centering prayer every day, multiple times a day, and silence throughout the day. And that rhythm, being in that pattern, it occurred to me, and it was not so much an intellectual understanding, but like a deep knowingness that what in Hinduism, what in Buddhism is referred to as complete and total awakening, realization of the ultimate human potential, in Christ is made manifest in physicality. The psychodrama, the psychospiritual drama of that in Christ is made manifest in time and space. That is, does that ring true? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, if you, in the Christian story, God takes on a particular human life in Jesus of Nazareth in a distinct way, in a way that's different from any other human life. So there's the scandal of particularity. And then Jesus takes on suffering. And if we're to follow him, then the way to follow him is to take on the particular suffering proper to my own life. Take up your cross and follow me. Take on the burden of conditioning and trauma that you've inherited and heal it by bringing it to the cross, uniting it with Christ and making way for resurrection. And I think that that's really important, that, and I think it's something distinct about Christianity, actually, in comparison with other traditions, is the degree to which it's willing to take on the scandal of the particular and find in it a way to liberation, that we come to liberation in and through the full embrace of our particular story. There's no dissociation from or disowning of materiality or the body or one's history, but one gains freedom from it in and through, in a sense.
Yeah, and which again brings us back to what we've talked about, monastic life, the radical embrace of limitation.
Right.
And for me, coming again from the Hindu background, there's a teaching where the world of perception, the world of particularity, world of differences, the world of the many is an illusion. Right? The only absolute reality is absolute reality, which is God, which is Brahman in Hinduism. and all else is an artifact of perception, born of judgment, born of our own positionalities that we've taken. And then coming to encounter Christianity, it was like even in the illusion, the real, the true has manifest and sanctified everything. So that was, at least that's how I understood it initially. And the other thing that was perhaps lacking, not because it's lacking in the tradition, but in my own particular spiritual growth, was so I come from Nepal, and the Nepali word Maya is also the Sanskrit word which means the
Illusion.
illusory nature of reality. But in Nepali, Maya also means love. And you can see how that's ripe for confusion. So I had also, and this is not just me, but other friends of mine who came from a similar background, negated love as attachment. And it is with Christianity, through Christianity, that I've come to own that no, perhaps human love often is also mixed in with attachment, but love is God. And that is what I've always been seeking, that love. And that expressed as my love for God, devotion for God. That's how I've come to understand and experience the Christian tradition.
Yeah, I think love is really the true expression of freedom. That's what freedom looks like in action, real spiritual freedom. And then it's between, the problem isn't with our loving, it's with fear that holds us back from fully loving, and greed or possessiveness, which leads us to attachment and to lock onto and to try to secure the object of love for ourselves forever, and that doesn't work either. So, but love itself is free, and it's what human freedom looks like in action.
Another point I want to run by you. In Hinduism, the ultimate question is, what am I? To discover the truth of your own being is to discover God. It seems to me that Christianity, the question is a little bit different. It's not so much who am I, but who is your neighbor? To find out who the other, quote unquote, other is, perceived neighbor is to discover God, which is not different than your own self.
Yeah, who am I a neighbor to? That's another way of asking the same question. And that's what when Jesus is asked, who is my neighbor, he puts it back on the person asking the question in just that way. The one who is my neighbor, who are you a neighbor towards? Are you going to stop and help the man at the side of the road, or are you going to pass by? I mean, that's the neighbor is the one you choose to behave as a neighbor yourself towards, in a way. So, yeah, those are rich questions. Going back to what you were saying about illusion, there's a sense in what Christianity speaks this way also, in saying that, God alone is unchanging. So in a certain sense, only God exists fundamentally. And creation is so contingent and conditional and fleeting. It never stands still. So what is it that exists? How can you say that anything exists because it never stands still? It's pure flux. So Christianity will speak this way as well. It's only in terms of our relationship with God, or as an idea in the mind of God, or, that we can be said to properly exist. And that's expressed in time in this realm that's constantly changing. So there is a way that Christianity speaks along those lines. And then in terms of who am I, like the Eastern traditions you mentioned, it's true that we can have a sense of self. I think even a Christian understanding can allow that we have a sense of self that can be quite illusory and quite different and much more limited in relation to the full reality of who we actually are. The true person that I am in Christ, my being in the image of God, versus the distorted likeness that I've locked onto and identified with. So I think there's points of commonality. I think that the closest to the embrace of particularity that I've described in Christianity seems to me to be in the Zen tradition, where samsara and nirvana are one. That somehow samsara is the place in which nirvana is discovered, or, all of these teachings, practice itself is enlightenment, and so on, that line.
It's Zen is very interesting in that way. I spent some time at a Zen monastery, and we would read or chant the Heart Sutra every day, and its form is formlessness, and that which is unmanifest is also the manifest.
Mm-hmm.
There is no distinction. And that's also one of the ways I've come to understand Christ, is to in all that is manifest, it is Christ. Earlier when we were talking about monastic life and committing to the monastic life, it's very revealing to me in the way that you talk about monastic life to think about my marriage, because it seems I make similar vows to love particular persons in a particular structure, and to give myself to that, which to hesitant minds may seem limiting, but really is freeing. And certain things, I think it was Jung who talked about marriage in this way. You can only work on certain things in yourself when you commit in that, no matter what way. Otherwise, there's always space to run away, avoid facing. But to commit yourself in that absolute way, there's nowhere to run.
Yeah, and that's certainly how it works in monastic life. You make a vow for life, and there's no turning back. And somehow that very commitment sets you free and allows you to experience and see your life in quite a different way. And, if you're stuck in a parish with a priest who gives bad homilies and people that think differently than you, if you can't take it anymore, you can just go to a different parish, and that's frequently what people do. They hop from place to place until they find a preacher they like or whatever. And in the monastery, it's kind of like an arranged marriage where you're not quite sure. You spend some time with the community, and you have 6 years before you actually make final vows, 7 years now. So, but you don't know what the future holds. People will die, new people will come. It's kind of signing a blank check in some ways, but that's part of the whole mystery, that you trust that somehow God has called you to this and he's going to make it fruitful. So that, when I came to make my own final vows, and people often ask, how can you commit for life? What if things change? What if you later feel it's not right? Or, but I was thinking, when I came up to final vows, I was thinking, well, it'll be kind of the ceremony for final vows and the actual commitment. I was thinking it might be kind of anticlimactic, in that I had already decided inwardly this is the way I was going to go and what I was called to. And yet in the retreat coming up to that ceremony of final vows, and then the actual ritual itself of making final vows, what I experienced very clearly is that it was much more about God vowing himself to me, and that my own vow was just the overflow of his faithfulness to me, and that he was committing himself to make this fruitful. I was taking on this particular set of limitations, and he was going to make it bear fruit. And once I saw it that way, because how could I vow to live this life, which is beyond my strength, which is a blank check, which I don't know what it's going to ask of me? How could I vow that? But once I saw it again as the overflow of his faithfulness to me, then it became very easy, because I've always experienced God's faithfulness to me. He's never let me down. He's always been that abundant source holding me up, always. So I experiencing it that way, with the emphasis on his support, and that reframed the whole thing. And it's what we were speaking about earlier. If I'm making decisions, can I do this? Should I do that? And we're all tangled up. It's because we're approaching it from the perspective of the autonomous ego, the executive I, trying to direct events in line with my preferences or how I think things should go, rather than the deep self spilling over from the abundance of and in alignment with the source. It's a very different experience.
Mhm. I love the way you talk about um, how your faithfulness to God is an is an expression of God's faithfulness to you. And this was something that occurred to me. It was very, very healing. I've always felt a deep longing for God, deep longing, and it always felt like the longing would feel incomplete. Like I long for God, and I think it was from the Sufis that I learned that, and it was a click like that. That no, the love that I experience for God is God's love for me. I am actually experiencing God's love for me to that degree, to the degree that I love God. And it is one and the same. It is an expression of God's love for me. So then it's not a longing of incompleteness, so to say, but an overflowing, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, it's God, loving God in and through me and
Mm-hmm.
transforming my humanity into God, deification. And St. Bernard imagines this, that in such a way that even my own self-love, my self-protective instinct, even my self-love is planted by God. It's a seed of divine love in me. It's part of how God takes care of me, is giving me the instinct to take care of myself,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's a interesting mind bender too.
Yes, yes. But
And that seed unfolds outwards. It starts off as an self-protective and gradually extends outwards and unfolds from a centrifugal to a centripetal love.
it continues to extend and
It
include.
opens like a
Yes.
bud that's initially closed in on itself and then turns into a flower.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But to say I believe in God, or to say I believe that God is love, it's one thing, but to completely truly believe that at all levels of your being, it seems is a much deeper thing. Because often, if we did truly at all levels of our being believe that God is love, and I am truly, deeply, unconditionally, infinitely loved, then there would be no cause for any fear,
Mm.
ever to act out of fear. So how does one, and I'm also holding in mind the idea of the unconscious, how does one integrate this belief at all levels of one's being?
Mm. Yeah, that makes me think of the verse, perfect love casts out fear. And I think it's a matter of, contemplative practice can be thought of as kind of steeping oneself and saturating oneself in divine love, resting in the reality of divine love. But God is loving us all the time. He's loving us into being, and he's loving us in and through the events and encounters that we have in the course of the day. Uh, One person said that my big role in life is to see God loving me through all. That was the first abbot at Genesee, Gerard McGinley. My big job in life is to see God loving me through all. And if we really believe, as Jesus taught, that our Father knows what we need before we ask, and that every hair on our head is numbered, then he's meeting our need in each moment. He's putting us in just the situation that we need to go forward. And we often think about things backwards. We think about rearranging external conditions so that they suit how we think things ought to be. But if we start from the reality of God loving us into being, and we experience in our marrow what it is to be the offspring of so good and so gracious a God who numbers every hair on our head and is giving us just what we need moment after moment. And we start from the interior. We start from that level where God is loving us into being, then it totally reframes the rest. It totally reframes how we encounter quote unquote external reality.
Yeah, and I think you've mentioned this in one of your interviews, and maybe this was also in your book about St. Bernard, that our understanding of God, our knowledge of God, our experience of God grows as our as we grow internally. So from a certain level of consciousness, let's say, we would experience and see and understand God in one way, but as we grow, it shifts and changes. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think that's pretty intuitive, that the self is like a lens, and if it's coated with a cataract, you're going to have blurry vision, and as the cataract is removed and breaks up, then you see more accurately. It's the same with God and the self. The self is like this eye, and it's covered over with the cataract. And that's the work of the spiritual life, in a way. Spiritual practice is to break up that cataract and dissolve it so that we can see more clearly, remove the obstructions that cloud our view.
Which again brings us back to then the the one. It was similar to saying the one who is the most loving sees reality most accurately, sees the truth. So love and truth then again come together.
Yeah, that's a key principle for the Cistercian writers, that amor ipse notitia est. Love itself is knowledge. Love itself is knowledge. And it's precisely in this sense. Love is like the sense of our being. And the sensus amoris, the Cistercians speak about, it's, our fundamental sense of being in the world, our affectus, our affectivity in the deep sense. It's, just that. It's like that lens. And so as that's healed and clarified, then we're able to give and receive love more freely.
What is contemplative prayer, and how does it differ from what people ordinarily think of as prayer?
I guess in a general way, it's a prayer where things like stillness and silence and rest and presence are to the fore, attention, keeping still, resting in God's presence, more of a passive and receptive dimension of prayer. And those features or those elements that I've just described could coincide with different kinds of prayer, or could have different accents and expressions. But that would be the gist of it, is a prayer of presence, prayer of the heart, prayer characterized by stillness and listening, rather than saying prayers, asking for things, and so on.
So if a person who's completely unfamiliar with this tradition was to come to you and ask, I want to practice this, would you give me instructions? What would you say?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to imagine, what is it that's motivating a person to spend time in stillness? I mean, one thing you might say is just come sit with me quietly in the chapel and see what happens. We'll talk about it or not. So it depends on where a person's coming from, what's motivating them.
What are some common difficulties or even pitfalls that may arise in the contemplative life that one should look out for?
Well, I mean, you could get attached to prayer as an end in itself and get stuck in an attachment to stillness. This is a danger, and different traditions speak about, where you just get sort of addicted to meditation or something, or some kind of interior state that you're aiming to have your meditation produce. And that's one trap. There's different ways your practice can kind of become stale, I guess. At times you have to constantly refresh it and keep in touch with what's really motivating you to spend time in quiet. And it could become kind of regressive in different ways. There's various pitfalls, I guess. Trying to get something out of your practice in one way or another, subtly or overtly.
On the one hand, you're saying one of the missteps would be to consider the practice itself an end, right? On the other hand, another misstep would be to consider it means to an end, so it is neither.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you think about trying to gain a certain state, or, there are expectations that trip us up. So if you think of it as trying to produce some inner state or bring about complete tranquility or lower your blood pressure or something, then that's a pretty limited approach. Yeah.
I see. Yes. God is always the end. Would that, or is that something too that?
I mean, yeah, if you're talking about God or your idea of God, we always have some understanding, and we can get limited by that. So
Mhm.
Meister Eckhart talks about the leave taking of God for God. We constantly have to break through and break away and leave leave one understanding behind to set out into the unknown. And that, I think, is really the key, is that openness to the unknown and an attitude of discovery and exploration, rather than getting stuck or fixated at any one point along the way.
When I was here last week with the St. Bernard's group, there are a couple of things you had said that I would like you to explain. One was this instruction, which is commonly heard in relation to contemplation and meditation. It's let through, let be, and let go. And the second is inhabit the pain fully to be free from it. Could you explain these two?
Well, the first one I was quoting another meditation teacher. That's in the Chan tradition of silent illumination. That was a guidance, but I think it's uh, in the context of the discussion we were having, it was useful to share that, and I think they're related, those 2 points. I mean, that approach from that meditation tradition that's saying let through, let be, and let go relates closely, or is one way to inhabit fully one's own weakness. You let whatever is troubling you, whatever you're experiencing in your body, whatever anxiety, fear, dread, bubble up to the surface. You let it break through into consciousness. You stay with it without judging it. And then when it's time and you've spent time with it, you release it and let it go. In the Christian terms, this has to do, again, with the experience of the cross. It's because Christ has already undergone our suffering in advance that we're able to find courage to inhabit it, because he's there with us in our suffering, in our brokenness.
So allowing whatever emerges. And I think this also relates to what you were saying that day, that the moment we become aware of our shortcomings or defects, that is a moment it has already been forgiven. And I understood it as in the psychoanalytic tradition, they talk about before you go deeper, you need to, in a way, what would be the right word? Make the superego less of a tyrant, less judgmental. Then it's safer to proceed within. The fact that something has emerged into our consciousness already means that, oh, we are open to receiving it. We are capable of receiving it.
Right.
So in prayer, when we sit and say, I'm sitting down and I'm constantly ruminating about something that happened a few years ago. So first you're saying, allow it to be there. Can you walk me through how you would?
Well, I think one important thing that's often overlooked in the West is the role of the body, and that, endless ruminating is pretty futile and doesn't really lead you anywhere. And it's hard to get off the treadmill. But if you pay attention to what's going on in your body when that endless rumination is going on, like where does it show up as a tension, as a pain? And then instead of listening to the ruminations, you focus your attention on the body, or the part of your body that feels constricted, and just listen to it. And it's quite striking how that can shift your relationship to whatever it is that's bubbling up. So I think it's important in stillness, in the presence of God, to become aware of what our body is trying to tell us.
Your most recent book is called Don't Judge Anyone. Is that correct?
Do not judge
Do not
anyone.
judge
Yeah.
anyone. Anyone at all. Not even those who have harmed us really, really badly.
Right. The book is Do Not Judge Anyone, Desert Wisdom for a Polarized World. And one of the questions, it focuses on the Desert Fathers, the first Christian monks, who put a strong emphasis on Jesus' teaching, do not judge and you will not be judged. So, of course, one of the things the book has to discuss is what is meant by judging. And part of the answer the book comes to is that judging is a counterfeit form of discernment. Discernment is the good, of which judgment is a distortion. And judgment is characterized by condemnation, wrath. It's divisive. It's a way of thinking over and against by putting another down to build myself up. And it ultimately hurts the person passing judgment. And it's not an effective way to correct injustice. So if I'm filled with outrage at an injustice, in a short term, that may move me to overcome my fear. But if it's a lingering resentment, if it's just an obsessive spinning of one's wheels, then it's not really going anywhere. So I answer along those lines.
So
that it hurts me to stay stuck in judgment meaning positioning myself over and against the other. It's I'm still stuck in reaction to the other person's violence, in other words.
And discernment then would be
a free response, somehow of creatively accepting the other person's violence and twisting it in a positive direction, or something along those lines.
How does, and maybe you've already answered the question, but how does one avoid the pitfall of letting oneself be taken advantage of, for instance? And I ask this also from personal experience, because if I am oriented towards lovingness and unconditional lovingness, I'm prone to seeing the good in people. I'm prone to seeing what unites us. I'm prone to seeing possibility for good. And that also, I found, makes me prone to missing red flags where there are real red flags. And red flags may not require condemnation, but it does require caution. So how does one avoid the pitfall of missing red flags?
Yeah, I mean, Jesus says, be innocent as doves and wily as serpents, right? So one can still be discriminating and perceptive and choose to act skillfully without closing one's heart, And so the spiritual discernment moves from a position of being with and for the good of all, which is how God acts in the world, how grace is manifest, how the Holy Spirit is working with and for the good of all, of every living creature. So if I can align myself with that, how can I act for the good of the person that is oppressing or persecuting me? And it may mean restraining them and getting them in jail, or me getting very far away from that person, or whatever. But in order for me to remain free, I need to get beyond simply reflexively reacting to their violence with counter-violence. That approach only hurts me, and it doesn't effectively correct the injustice.
Earlier, you talked about, I believe this was something the previous abbot or one of the first abbots here had said, my task is to see how God is loving me through everyone. Does the everyone include even people who may have harmed us? Is that also part of God's love? Maybe, and I can understand that from a Hindu or a Buddhist perspective of karma, in that it is an opportunity for me to undo whatever needs to be undone, whatever limiting belief I may be holding, whatever inaccuracies I may have in my own self-perception that is bringing this to myself. But how do you make sense of that in a Christian context?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to see it as, I deserve this somehow, or that, but it's possible to experience, or to believe at least, that God is loving one in and through every situation. It starts with the recognition I mentioned earlier that God is loving us into being at each moment. There's the idea of continuous creation. God didn't just create us and set the universe free, but he's loving us into being each moment. So even if he's loving me into being in an and I'm grounded in that and anchored in that, even if the external situation is quite painful, I can begin to see that God might somehow be expressed in advance or drawing me closer to himself in and through the experience of suffering, uniting me to his own suffering on the cross in Christ, and so on. But certainly in different situations, it can be a very hard pill to swallow. A person has to discern themselves from within in different moments. Where is God in this situation? But he's always present in the cross, and he's always present within suffering and the suffering of injustice. He's aligned himself with the outcast, with the victim.
I'm going to ask two questions that someone else asked me to ask you. One is, you've talked about this, how a monk is someone who's been touched by God's grace and now spends his entire life in gratitude for that. Are there times when God's presence feels unavailable? When you experience prolonged periods of dryness? And what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, most recently, I haven't had an experience of, I wouldn't exactly call it dryness, but it's a sense of being in suspension, of being between things, of being up in the air, an extended period of waiting, let's say, for like 5 or 6 years, waiting for the next thing to come along. And then when it came along, it was like the wedding of Cana. You have saved the best wine until now. It was something so unforeseen and so right that I knew it was from God, and it opened up a whole new stage. And, you know, that's often the case, that there's a ripening process, there's subterranean energies that are realigning, and we have to be patient and trust that God is turning all things to good. But, you know, it may seem like it may be several years or, you know, whatever. Yeah.
The second question, related, is boredom. Do you experience boredom?
Occasionally, not very often. I think that if you're paying attention, it's impossible to be bored. And that if you're bored, it means you're not paying attention. That's my experience.
Okay. Tell me about your love of poetry and how that intersects with your prayer life.
Yeah, that's something that kind of comes and goes. It's something that I've been attracted to and have written since I was very young. And at a certain point, it's connected to my vocation, because around the time I was 16 or 17, I remember reading this particular anthology of poetry, mystical poetry from different traditions. And it really opened a door. It was like seeing like language becoming transparent to another dimension. And it opened up something in me, a sense of what the spiritual actually meant or could be, and how language could become transparent to this other dimension of reality. And it woke something up in both the poet in me and the monk, and somehow in their intersection, I guess. And yeah, it's something that just at certain points arises. It's another way of paying attention to your life that seems fitting at certain times. And it's not the central focus of my life, but it's a delight, and it's part of who I am and how I experience the world.
Am I correct in saying you're working on a book of Ryokan's poetry?
Yeah, it's finished. It's coming out before too long, probably in the winter, this coming winter.
Is it a translation or a commentary that you're
It's a
doing?
translation, yeah. So it's a co-translation, since I don't read Japanese, with a former monk of this community who is a professional translator of Japanese. And we collaborated on this project, and he would give me rough, literal renderings of Ryokan's poems, and I would kind of finesse them into English modern contemporary poetic English that hopefully has some of the feel of the original.
And it's called This and That. So when I looked you up on Google, there's Isaac Slater, and then there's also John Slater. So I wasn't sure if all of the publications were you, but there's also a poem collection of Hafiz's poems. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's you.
Yeah. John is my legal name,
Yes.
Isaac my religious name, so Jekyll and Hyde, or however you think about them. But yeah, so my poetry titles are generally published under my secular name, and my writings connected to monastic studies are under my religious name, my monastic name, Isaac.
Hafiz is one of my favorite
Great.
poets.
Yeah.
The something about the Sufis in the way they express this love of God. It's just beautiful and profound, and
Hafiz is terrific. And I co-translated that with my cousin, Jeffrey Einboden, who did his doctoral work at Cambridge on Emerson's translations of Hafiz.
Oh.
And so it kind of began there. But interestingly, I mentioned that anthology of poetry from different mystical traditions, both Hafiz and Ryokan, I would have read for the first time in that anthology, which opened up so much. And here I've ended up working on 2 translations of their work. So that's lovely to see how these things play out.
How did you come upon Zen? Tell me about your interest in Zen and how that's affected your own practice.
Yeah, it's something I gravitated to and had a strong sense of affinity with or attraction to when I was around 16 or 17, in connection, like in reading that book of poems, as I mentioned, the ones that most struck me were, Basho and Ryokan and other mostly Japanese Zen poets. So I guess I read around in that area when I was younger and met a couple of people that were Zen practitioners that had some influence on me. And then I think I had to come to terms with Christianity in some way, having grown up in that tradition. And I didn't really know too many people in the Zen world or any Zen communities at the time that I was thinking about monastic life. But even my gravitation to Christian monasticism was connected with that affinity with Zen practice as I experienced or understood it. And then, so it was always kind of in the background in the Christian contemplative tradition. Kind of wisdom Christianity has some overlap with Zen practice. But then about 7 or 8 years ago, it kind of came to the fore again. And part of that was really resonating deeply with the writings of Shunryo Suzuki. And for whatever reason, that just connected in a very deep way and drew me into the practice of sitting meditation once again, or in a more concerted and definite way, regular way. And so that's what I do. I sit zazen and live as a Catholic monk and see how that changes my perception of things.
And you also serve, part of your role here is to work at the infirmary. Is that correct? Yes. And you mentioned this phrase last time I was here on Wednesday, the spirituality of dying. Could you talk more about what you've learned working at the infirmary and what is the spirituality of dying?
Yeah, so for most of the 25 years that I've been here, I've worked with the aging monks, often being with them as they prepare for death. And that's been a very helpful process in keeping me real. And we spoke about the radical embrace of limitation. That's the ultimate limitation, is death. And we tend to gloss over and ignore it as best we can. But it's extremely clarifying to live into the face of death, that there's a finish line. And that if you live in the light of that, it reframes the rest, even if we believe it's not an ultimate finish line. So being with monks as they approach that limit, it's quite an honor, and it's a mysterious process. And there's a certain energy that arises when you're in the process of dying and you're around a deathbed. There's such a stillness and a sense of expectancy, and it can be a very profound experience at times, also very difficult. People die in many different ways. There have been two who died recently, and one was the most difficult death that I'd seen in 25 years, and the one after that was the most peaceful and simple. And so it's a great mystery.
But by difficult, you mean like physical pain or social circumstances?
More the headspace of the person. They were dying somewhat younger than expected. It was a brain disease, so there was some degree of confusion and kind of psychiatric symptoms, and just a lot of anguish and so on. So it's hard to be present to and with and to watch and try to support that person. But yeah, it's a very mysterious thing. I don't know how much I have to say about it, really. Just that you do the best you can to be with and to support that person as they're passing through the gate.
I mentioned last time I teach the meaning of death class, and the first time I taught it, actually, and I was not prepared to teach that class at all. I inherited it from my predecessor, and I was afraid to teach it because what do I know about death? But the first time I taught it, too, to add to all of that, there was a terminal person in the class. She was auditing the class.
Wow.
And she was a former student. And if someone like that asked you, how do I die? What would you say? Like the how, if you were to say the how to
I mean,
of dying?
realistically, you're probably going to die the way you lived, you know? So I think that the process of dying brings out the best and the worst in the person dying and in the person taking care of them also. That's the challenge. It puts things under a certain pressure. And, you know, the work of dying, I'm no expert. I haven't, we're all in the process of dying in the broad sense, but none of us has actually experienced death. So it's hard to speak about the meaning of something that none of us has experienced. We've only seen it from the outside. We may experience dying, but not death properly. So I think there's a natural process that happens where a person starts to work through things from their past and to integrate. It shows up in their dream life, and, you know, something deep down is preparing them for the process, except in the case of sudden deaths, right? But when a person has a prolonged experience of dying from old age, from an illness, etc., then there is a certain preparation. And how does one lean into that? I think surrender is probably the key word. Uh, Surrender, humility, acceptance of one's limitation, um, saying things that might need still to be said, pondering the meaning of one's life, gratitude for the good that's been in one's life, healing of resentments, letting go of as much as possible. Those would all be part of the work.
In your own spiritual life currently, what is the frontier, or what is the work that is being done? What is being let go, or what is the limitation you're working to embrace?
Hmm. That's a good question. Well, I mean, in a certain sense, it's always the same. It's the limits of this body mind that I inhabit in this moment. And how can I, however I'm experiencing that, how can I open that to the light of grace and be responsive to how God's love is being manifest in and through me from the depths and in the circumstances and encounters that make up my day. So in that way, it's always the same. In terms of any particular place that I'm experiencing that limitation, hard to put my finger on anything specific beyond what I've just described. I inhabit this moment, I inhabit this personal history, this body, and whatever that looks like on a given day. It may be a struggle with a relationship in the community or an anxiety that's bubbling up. It may be a physical ailment of some kind. Um, yeah, often challenges in relationship make you aware of your limits and your sore spots. So
What is something about spiritual life, the contemplative life, that you believed when you set out on this path that you now think was inaccurate?
yeah, I think it was very much, unconsciously often acting from, the ego, trying to fix the ego, taking up certain practices because they made me feel good, or I thought they were things I was supposed to be doing, or, and it ends up being self-reinforcing the practices that we take up. And now it's much more about acceptance and surrender and following the way rather than, doing a bunch of things to make myself feel better about myself.
If you were to write an autobiography, what would you title it?
I wouldn't. I wouldn't write an autobiography, and I would leave it untitled if I did. How's that for a non-answer?
That's pretty good. Is there anything we did not address that you think is important to say?
An autobiography of my non-existent self. Yeah. Is there anything that I haven't said? Was that the question?
Yeah, or any topic or
Oh,
anything we didn't
I've
mention.
probably said too much already, so I don't think I have anything to add.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Father
Yeah, it's my
Slater.
pleasure. Thank you.